Good morning and welcome. I'm thinking you're all feeling as energized as I do after that wonderful talk by Rhonda McGee. And I think we're going to get even more energized hearing what Rob Roeser has to say. Rob is the Bennett Pierce Professor of Caring and Compassion and Professor of Human Development and Family Studies at Penn State University. He received his PhD from the combined program in education and psychology at the University of Michigan and holds master's degrees in religion and psychology, developmental psych, and clinical social work. He has been a Fulbright Scholar in India, a William T. Grant Faculty Scholar, and from 2006 to 2010 served as the Senior Program Coordinator for the Mind and Life Institute. He has also worked as a Professor of Psychology and Human Development at Portland State University. Rob's research focuses on the developmental effects of schooling on students' motivation, learning, well-being, and identity development across childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. He is also interested in the professional development of teachers, especially with regard to the developmental knowledge of students and professional dispositions such as mindfulness and compassion for self and others. His other research interests have included cultural identity development among urban adolescents during a period of rapid globalization in India, the emergence of a national identity in South Africa during the post-apartheid era, the role of religion and spirituality in the positive development of immigrant youth in the United States. Rob's Mindfulness, Compassion, and Human Development Lab at Penn State is devoted to the study of the putative effects of mindfulness and compassion training for teachers, parents, and students with regard to health and well-being, learning, and ethical development. Studies underway are investigating if such trainings represent viable and effective means of cultivating the self-regulatory skills and motivational dispositions that adults and young people all need to thrive and flourish in the 21st century in terms of a healthy body, a calm and clear mind, and a kind and generous heart. And having worked with Rob for about 18 months on this conference, I can say that he embodies all of those things, and it is my great pleasure to introduce him to you today.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was very sweet. Well, good morning. I had to take off my coat. I'm running a little warm this morning. I want to thank Erin for that generous and kind introduction. And I really want to thank the Mind and Life Institute for this gathering and for this invitation. It's really my great privilege and honor to be here. And I also want to thank my new friend, Srinivas Reddy, for that beautiful, beautiful music this morning. Really, thank you for setting the tone. What I'd like to talk a little bit about today is school systems, educational reform, and mindfulness training. Questions that we've been asking in the research, some of the research findings in the recent work, which have really led to more questions, which I think is one of the themes of this conference. As our discipline matures, we find more and more questions. I also just want to start out by saying how healing it has been for me, and perhaps for some of you, to be in this community, to be in this room with those of you who have some shared intentions in this wider Mind and Life community during this time. I think we all have shared intentions to want to realize a kind of happiness in our lives through serving others, and that's a rare thing to be around so many people who have that shared commitment. I think we're all committed to creating a more just, compassionate, and kind world through the vehicle of education. And I think probably, I can speak for the room, we're really motivated by a curiosity and a deep passion for exploring this interface between contemplation and the inner life's cultivation and the use of that for the good of the world and creating social transformation in educational systems. So it's really good to be here with all of you. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a little about a program of research that I've been engaged in with my colleagues and students over the last 10 years, and to offer some reflections and conundrums in that work, as well as some findings. As many of you know, and my friend Kim Schonert-Reichel and I collected so many works from so many of you in the Handbook of Mindfulness in Education, our field has really evolved and one could say exploded. And I think perhaps we're at a time to pause and reflect and think about what sort of version 2.0 of the work in schools around contemplation looks like. And I was talking to Tish Jennings the other day and recalling a meeting, I think it was a Mind and Life Education research meeting in around 2006, where we were talking about, we had all developed, many of us had developed new programs and were interested in introducing them in education at that time. But it was sort of a supply side time where we had this thing and we thought it could be of use in the world. And so we were kind of seeking contexts and places to try that out. And I think since that time, say 2007, 2008, 10 years later or so now, we're in a different time where many of us are experiencing a demand-side request for these programs from schools. And part of the story I want to tell today is moving from supply side, where we're trying to convince the world this may be helpful, now to thinking about how can we really meet school educators, administrators, and leaders where they are, and think about how think about their needs and the kinds of work that might serve their needs in various local contexts. Some of the basic questions I'd like to explore with you today are really, what are some of the key entry points and aims of these secular contemplative programs in educational systems? Is it employee wellness? Is it student outcomes? Is it change in pedagogical practice? Is it communicating that the district cares for their membership? What are some of the relevant targets of change for these programs? Is it the teacher? Is it the classroom setting? Should it be whole school? Significant in the findings I'll show you today that I've been thinking a lot about is, what is the time course of developmental change in the contemplative life for those that participate in such changes? And we can think about our own lives. How long do we think these things take to become embodied and enacted in our behavior? And finally, hopefully we can conclude with some of what is the next generation of education-based work? What might it look like? And I'll offer some reflections from the perspective of my own work. I'm not going to explain this slide in any great detail, but one of the themes that I think we've heard consistently over time, and Rhonda McGee just made a similar theme, raised it up in her talk this morning, is behind all of this work, and what I want to say today, is a need, I believe, for us to really examine the zero-order implicit assumptions that we have about human beings and learning and human development, and really moving from a worldview in which individuals are seen as separated from contexts and each other, where we think about things like the individual versus the environment, or genes versus the environment, moving from that kind of dualistic worldview and frame, which is often individualistic in outlook, to a more relational or dialectic worldview, thinking about how apparent opposites, the person and the environment, for instance, interpenetrate each other. And in doing so, really moving from a 400-year-old vision of what a human being is, kind of like a machine, kind of like mechanisms, kind of like a clockwork, to really thinking more in terms of organic metaphors, in terms of community, in terms of interconnection. And this is a hard-fought, this has been a hard-fought and widely debated issue in developmental science, and I think it has a lot of relevance to the work that we're doing in contemplative science. And I'll come back to that theme of relationship and interdependence and interconnection at several points in my talk. I also want to acknowledge, if Margaret Cullen is here this morning, I don't know that she is, but she's been my 10-year collaborator, and the work that I'll talk about today has really been on a program that she created, beautiful program called the Mindfulness-Based Emotional Balance Program. And I'll say a little more about that, but each of the studies that I've done over the last 10 years has been around this work and in collaboration with Margaret. So I'm deeply grateful for that relationship as a key dimension of my own work. So, as I said, over about the past 8 to 10 years, I've been engaged in a program of research. And in the first phase of that research, we were really developing the program with Margaret and thinking about how we might test it in the schools. And we engaged in a series of feasibility and process and initial efficacy studies as to whether this program could have beneficial effects for teachers who engaged in it. And so we conducted, with Kim Schonert-Reichel, another one of my key collaborators, we conducted a series of studies in Canada and in the United States to start to examine the effects of this program. And one of the things that John Dunn was talking about yesterday in his talk was the importance of relationships and community and interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary relationships. And I can say that without the support of people like Mark Greenberg and Richie Davidson and the Mind and Life Research Network or Kim Schonert-Reichel's lab, I really would not have been able to make very much progress on any of this work. So it really does sort of take a community of thinkers and practitioners to engage in this work. That early phase of work, which I'm not going to talk about today, was done with special educators and parents of special needs students, with elementary and secondary school teachers in Canada and the United States. And some of the findings suggested there was improved teacher and parent well-being, there was diminished teacher stress, burnout, and distress in the form of anxiety and depression. And then a more recent paper by my friend and colleague Tori Crane really looked at the spillover effects of this workplace mindfulness program on things like sleep quality, ruminating on your job when you're at home at night, and your mood when you got home, and really showed that there seemed to be some of this spillover. I should say a lot of these studies are based on self-report measures, and one of the key vulnerabilities in all of the work I'll tell you today is we can't really rule out some of the biases that go along with self-report, nor did we use an active control group in this work, so we can't rule out the non-specific effect of being in a caring community where someone is listening to you and attending to your needs and trying to help you. It might well have been that we had a knitting group and we all shared food every week and we would have gotten some similar findings. So I think in the next round of work, we really need to consider active controls in the work, and that's an important limitation of that work. Finally, one of my students who's here, Cynthia Taylor, and others started to look at some of the ways that maybe these programs were engendering some of these well-being effects in terms of changes in the way that we appraise the emotional significance of stressors, change in our use of coping strategies, improve efficacy beliefs for dealing with emotions in the workplace, and increase self-compassion for oneself as a teacher who struggles just like other teachers. So we've really tried to both look at the, not mechanisms, the intervening processes that might explain some of the outcomes in the work. So starting in around 2012, my colleague Kim Schonert-Reichel, who had been working tirelessly on studying MindUp and this program with me, started to put those together, and she did a beautiful little small study to look at what was the effect on teachers and child outcomes if you just implemented a student program, or just implemented a teacher program, or if you sequenced them together so that we were preparing the teachers to implement the child program. And there was some indication in that work that really having a teacher program to prepare them was supportive of the implementing of the child program, but we also learned that sometimes the implementation of the child program by teachers cultivated an interest for them to have more mindfulness for themselves. So I don't think we came to any orthodox position on the sequencing of them, but that maybe seeing the whole system, students and educators together, was very important. I think that was the insight of that. And so in the second phase of the work, which I'm going to tell you about two studies today, we really started to look at the effects on teachers and classrooms and program implementation, one in an early elementary school setting in grades K through 3, and then in a second study in middle schools for subject matter teachers, grades 6 to 8. And as many of you may know or you may not know, a lot of the work on mindfulness in education has really focused on elementary school, and we really wanted to start thinking about middle and secondary school settings. So I'll talk a little about this second phase of work and try to draw some insights for what we learned, what questions were raised by it, and where we might take those insights into the future. So the first study, I'll call it the early elementary school study, was a proof of concept, quasi-experimental study that really looked at the sequential implementation of the teacher mindfulness program and the Mind Up program in kindergarten to third grade classrooms. And the important part of this slide is this line at the bottom, that this was really a private foundation, university, and school district partnership, and that we were all working together and sharing insights. The Gates Foundation gave a grant to this Educational Support District 112 in Vancouver, Washington, and we partnered with the Evergreen School District to start to explore the sequential implementation of teacher and student programs. And I'm so happy to say that many of those people who were part of that collaboration are in the room today, and I wish that was one of the outcomes of our study, creating a community and having them join this community. Here's just a smattering of the massive amount of people that were necessary to undergo this study, and it was really a team effort. So again, what we did in this study is we wanted to implement Margaret's programs for some of the teachers in the treatment school. The first year, this is a 8-week program. It has between 9 and 11 sessions, depending on the locale and the footprint of what's possible. This eventuates in about 28 to 36 hours of program contact. There's 2 Saturday silent retreats. And it may sound a lot like MBSR, and that's important because Margaret is a certified trainer of MBSR, and about 60% of this program is really aimed at those skills. I think Margaret's genius in this program, starting with the Cultivating Emotional Balance program, working with Tish Jennings and other people in the room, Mark Greenberg, was really to start to infuse emotion theory and some of the ideas of Paul Ekman and others into it. What are emotions? How can we learn about them? And then to use that kind of didactic understanding of emotions to start applying mindfulness to very specific emotions like fear, anger, kindness, and compassion. And a second key part of the program was a focus on forgiveness, which is not a topic we hear enough about, but perhaps in the coming years we should. that transgressions happen in life, and how can we create relationship repair after them? And so Margaret has done some really beautiful work in the cancer community around this concept and brought it into the education work. In addition to that program, we wanted to introduce, after the Teacher Mindfulness program, the Mind Up program by the Hahn Foundation, which many of you may know consists of 15 weekly lessons based in positive psychology, neuroscience, mindfulness practice, and social emotional competencies. And there's a core practice that's done for about 1 minute 3 times a day, which is listening to a resonant sound as a focused attention practice. And then there are these lessons on very specific topics, moving from mindfulness to perspective taking, to savoring of positive experiences, to gratitude, and then to sort of taking those kinds of skills and dispositions and doing some active service in the world with them. And I'll just say one thing about this. We worked a lot with the Mind Up program, and we offered the traditional one-day training. And then what we also created in this project was a professional learning community that met every month after the initial training so that we could bring the teachers together to both collectively plan and share resources and also continue their own practice. So we really thought how can we not just provide an initial training, but continue ongoing support for the implementation of this work. The theory of change was ambitious, I think, for a project where we got the grant, I think, on August 15th, and the project started on September 1st. We all had to practice our own mindfulness. It was quite a ride for my students and I in the lab, if you remember, students. But our thinking was this, that the Empower program, or the MBEB program, sorry, there's several different names that have been applied to it, would be helpful in producing the kinds of teacher outcomes we'd seen in the first phase of the work, and that this may have implications for the implementation of the Mind Up program. It may sort of familiarize teachers with the material and support their teaching of mindfulness to their little ones in their class. It might also create a more emotionally supportive classroom. We reasoned if teachers were a bit stressed, a bit less anxious, a bit less depressed, they might have more energy available to reinvest in relationships and teaching, and that this might have some long-term distal outcomes on things like children's executive function and prosocial dispositions, as has been shown in the work of Kim Schonert-Reichel in elementary school samples. As I said, the study design was a non-randomized quasi-experimental study. We implemented the teacher and then the student mindfulness programs within a K-3 setting in one of the schools, and compared it to a second school that was in waiting, and then in the second year, we implemented the programs in the second school and continued the work in the first school. I just want to say here, thank you to the principals of those two schools who are in the room for going with us. That was really wonderful. These were K-5 elementary schools, each with student populations that came from predominantly socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. The study included 24 teachers who had an average of about 9 years teaching experience, and then we sampled about 10 students in each of the classrooms of each of the participating students to assess the student outcomes. So in terms of the teacher program, the first stop on the journey, which I think many of us often skip over, is if people don't come or don't like it, it's probably not going to work. So I think that we really need to look within the black box of our interventions and to really try to understand this acceptability and engagement with the practices and the program. Because I think if we miss that mark, nothing else in our logic model is going to occur. In this case, we also faced a conundrum because we were paying teachers for the first time to attend, and so that created an interesting dilemma around who and why were people participating. But nonetheless, people came, and perhaps it was for the incentivization rather than for other reasons like relief of suffering, but I suspect, and I think we have evidence that that was in there too. And if we made the criterion 7 out of 9 of the total sessions, almost everyone in the sample completed that. And then we had a graduate student who sat through all of the sessions as a support and a participant and observer, and she just was asked to rate the engagement of teachers in each of the weekly sessions, and you can see that there was a fair amount of engagement in the program. There was also some issues with the timing and the intensity and the tempo and what else was going on in the school setting that I'll come back to, because we ended up redesigning some of this program in collaboration with our partners. So I want to tell you a little about the teacher outcomes. As I said, I think I remember my friend Oko Visser, who supported a lot of the development of this program early on. He used to say, what we're trying to do is to help people start to engage in a contemplative lifestyle. And I always thought that was sort of a nice framing of what we're trying to do, so to sort of help people explore the inner life and take up some sort of formal or informal practice in which that became more routine and habitual. And so just as one indicator of that, we assess how many of our teachers had a meditation practice before and after they began the program. And as you can see here at baseline, actually a lot more people in the waitlist control school reported having a meditation practice. but after the training, not surprisingly, because we asked them to meditate 15 minutes a day for 8 weeks, teachers reported in the intervention school 62% having somewhat of a regular practice that they did not every day necessarily, but every week or often enough. We didn't find the same change in movement practices in terms of taking up a yoga practice, even though that is featured in the program. And often one of the most preferred parts of the program in some of our previous studies, and often the teachers ask for more of that, but we didn't necessarily find that here. So in terms of teacher outcomes, we had a proximal and a distal set. The proximal outcomes were the skills and dispositions that the program itself is trying to train. People often early on would say, what is it about mindfulness? What is the key ingredient about mindfulness and why it works? And I'd say, I think it's mindfulness. I think it's being mindful. It's not some other, it's not a proxy for something else. It's that habit itself. And then that habit obviously can have instrumental utility value for other things, as my friend Jelaine Sorensen, who was actually the instructor trained by Margaret in delivering the interventions in this study, likes to say that mindfulness allows choice. So we're always starting with awareness, which then allows us to choose what we might do next or how we might apply it. And so the study is grossly underpowered, and we've heard that that is a serious problem in much of the field, and so it is with this study. So I am presenting the p-values of these comparisons, but actually the effect sizes would have been a better thing to do, and I just didn't have time. And the effect sizes, I would say, are in the small to moderate range for these effects, even if they're not significant. And so we see over time a small improvement in teacher mindfulness as self-reported on the 5-factor mindfulness questionnaire. And important part of teaching mindfulness is this being kind and gentle with oneself. And we also saw significant improvements in the treatment group in being kind and compassionate and non-judgmental in one's role as a teacher after training. There was also indications, although they didn't meet the usual significance level test here, that the teachers in the initial treatment implementation group showed declines in the Maslow burnout inventory over time and in the perceived stress scale, whereas over time, across the course of the school year, teachers in the waitlist control group actually showed increases in those processes. And I should say, even though this graph isn't significant, I do remember the superintendent of elementary education being very compelled by this. And one of the reasons for that was, and this goes to the issue of taking a broad view of history and context and time, as Rhonda McGee was saying. This program was actually implemented in a year in the state of Washington in which Common Core, a new teacher evaluation program, and a new student assessment program were coming online. And some of the teachers in the study said it was the most stressful year in about 20 years of their teaching. So I think that kind of gave some backdrop to this graph and why it might have been compelling to that administrator at the time. We also tried to look at an objective behavioral measure of attention delivered in classrooms on flimsy laptops after school, which is always fun to try to bring the lab into the world. And we really wanted to see if we could observe changes in things like working memory or response inhibition or mental flexibility. And the evidence really didn't show any effects on those behavioral measures of attention and memory function. There was one sort of interesting little finding that I just highlighted because we'll see it in the children, that on this flanker task, which asks you to inhibit a prepotent response accurately, teachers started to get a little bit better at doing that quickly, but that was not significant. So we also wanted to look into the classrooms to see if the training might affect the nature of the culture of the classroom and the student interactions in that classroom. So like many of my colleagues who are working in this field, we decided to use the class observation system, and that really shouldn't say class S. This is the class system for elementary schools. And we were looking at 2 hypothesized potential classroom outcomes, which was perhaps following training with a little more energy and a little less stress, teachers might show up in their interactions with students in a more socially and emotionally supportive way, and maybe the classroom would appear a bit more organized and managed better as distress and burnout receded a bit and mindfulness and self-compassion improved. And so we did an enormously complex observational study with Andy Mashburn, who's an expert in this, and worked with Bob Pianta for many years, who developed this measure. We did video recordings in this, many observations to try to make sure that the reliability and the validity of the observation measures was sufficient. And I won't go into those details now. But again, to make a long story short, we didn't find within the context of from the beginning of the school year to the end of the school year, any change in observers who were blind to the condition of teachers' ratings of the emotionally supportive nature of the classroom, nor the classroom organization. Although not much change there. The one thing about this graph I would say, though, is if you looked at national averages on class scores, these were really good teachers. These are pretty high class scores from the outset compared to other things, so we might have been sort of working against that a little bit, too. I'm not going to go into the effects on children too much, just to say that we asked teachers to keep an implementation log. Thank you, Kim Schonert-Reichel, for this measure. As they implemented the lessons, did they find that the students were engaged in them and there was high engagement? I'm not showing you a graph. There were some challenges with actually the teachers implementing all 15 lessons given time constraints. Probably the most implemented practice was the brain break, and that was on average between 1 and 2 times a day. We then also looked at the student outcomes. We were looking at teacher-related grades and achievement, their pro-social dispositions, and also students' attention and executive function using the NIH toolbox. And we found a small, significant effect of the students in being able to inhibit a prepotent response, which is one of the findings that Kim Schonert-Reichel has published in a developmental psychology article. And we didn't find much change in this cognitive flexibility measure of the NIH toolbox. So just to summarize, in this study, we found that teachers attended and generally liked the program. They reported starting to meditate. They reported improvements in their well-being and occupational health, but we did not document changes in their attention and memory as measured behaviorally. And we did not find changes in classroom outcomes. There was some indication, and I didn't present, we have some nice qualitative studies that Cynthia Taylor and other of my graduate students have done, that the program was helpful in implementing Mind Up, and we found some small improvements in executive function, but no indication of change in grades with regard to pro-social disposition or other things once you controlled for what the students were like at the pre-test. However, I think what happened, as I kind of alluded to, was that the change in employee wellness and the link of the mindfulness content to other kinds of currents that were going on in the district at the time really seemed to speak to those other needs. And so the work went forward, and really the work has now unfolded over about 3.5 years. And so I just want to tell you a little about what happened next. I want to tell you some questions, and then I'll tell you what happened next with regard to the results, because we obviously didn't find everything we thought we would find. So why is that? So one question is, as I already alluded to, I wonder what the developmental time course of change is for some of these things. It's quite obvious from the field that effects on well-being and mental health can happen in a shorter term time frame, and perhaps we can reflect on our own practice in the time course of some of these things. But how long would it take to get these changes into our behavior and our embodied behavior in a complex system like the classroom following training? I think there is a beautiful study by Mark Greenberg and Tish Jennings. Is it okay to talk about that here? a very large study in New York City that was much well-powered, and they did show effects on these classroom outcomes. And the nature of those effects was it was sort of preventative of a normal decline over time as the year went on. And so I think it's possible, but I'm very curious, and my move to Penn State has really made me think a lot more about time. What's a realistic time frame for ourselves or for the teachers to do this? Especially when someone's in there with a video camera, looking at you, et cetera, et cetera. It's fairly complicated. So I think we have to think about time. And one of the things that has happened is as time has gone by, our collaborative relationship has fostered more innovation. And it would be helpful and hopeful to go back and do some longer-term follow-up in these places. It also raises the question, what's the appropriate contextual target for these interventions? Here we were working with K-3 teachers, and that was an interest of the Gates Foundation and the reason for the grant. And is that the right approach, really focusing on a subset of teachers, or should we be thinking about whole school change, or how should we be thinking about what the target of this is really? And then those of us who do this work, we're in this instrumentality, non-instrumentality dance. How do we say this program is for your well-being, and it may well have benefits, but not foreground the instrumentality of these benefits such that it's another thing to achieve at or beat yourself up at if you're not good at? How do we kind of manage this tension in the work? And lastly, and this is an open question that I'm so excited to explore in this next phase, you know, really, as Jon Kabat-Zinn said once, this inner work, perhaps it should really be more invitational than indoctrinational. And so it really, can it be mandated, or shouldn't it, or how do we move a system and a set of actors in a system towards change without being, in some ways, coercive and really undermining our own long-term desired outcome, which is to empower individuals to change themselves in their own worlds and have the freedom to do that or not to do that, really. Okay, so I have to keep going and go much quicker, but the good news is the second study is the exact same story, so I'm just going to zip through it. So what happened next? I remember my friend Bonnie, who is here, sort of saying, well, I didn't want to get in the way of the study. So she was just the most wonderful principal, and we said, oh, what a mistake of design that was. We really should have figured out a way to bring Bonnie into the study immediately, so we started to think about a leadership program. We had focused on the teachers, but we hadn't seen really the importance of the school leader in managing and leading the change. And so that came out of our collaboration. The teachers in year 2 who took the program had some very strong feedback about it would be so nice if the teacher program articulated more closely with the Mind Up program so that we could see the links. And so Jelaine Sorensen created a shorter, redesigned, we called it R-Empower, redesigned Empower, which was really focused much more on how the content of the MBEB program and the content of Mind Up could be closely aligned. Our colleagues at ESD 112 developed all sorts of material supports, library books, and for the implementation of Mind Up, so there wouldn't be this burden of trying to figure out how to get the materials and everything for the course. And then last night, much to my delight, I saw my colleagues here, and I said, what's going on? And it turns out that in those schools, in the last year or so, the training has been offered to all teachers in the school. One of our colleagues, Karina McIntyre, was working with Lily Lengua, who may be in the room here, who has a nice parenting program, and we started to offer that at the schools. And I understand there's some wider applications for counselors and special educators going on in the district. So the work has kind of moved forward. Okay. So I want to just tell you a little about a second study, and the important part about this slide is it's a private foundation university school partnership again between the William T. Grant and Spencer Foundation, Portland State University, and in this case, Portland Public School District. The other one was in Vancouver, right across the river, and there was a lot of cross-fertilization going on between these two projects over time, which was also very helpful to those of us thinking about this. Our logic model was similar. We thought the mindfulness training would help teachers develop mindfulness. What does mindfulness training do? I think it helps people develop mindfulness, I hope, and that may have some benefits for health and these downstream outcomes. And we were really interested in this case, again, in looking at the classroom outcomes and in middle school settings where we know that the setting can become less developmentally appropriate than the elementary school setting. So we see early adolescence, similar to the previous study in early childhood, as these key transitional windows in which this work may be most beneficial. This was a randomized control study where we initially randomized 58 teachers to treatment and waitlist control groups. We did baseline assessments at the beginning of the year, post-program assessments at the end of the year, and follow-up in the fall, and we just have the pre-post data for today. There was very little attrition from the study, as you can see here, and we ran it in terms of 2 cohorts. Again, the teachers were fairly experienced, about 10 years, and we chose school subject matter teachers from the core subjects of humanities and math and science, social studies and English, math and science. I want to go quicker so that we have time. These were volunteers. No one was getting paid for this program. The teachers came. They said they practiced the requested 15 minutes of practice a day, and about 90% said they'd recommend the program to their colleagues. So we think it was well accepted. We looked at the same suspects that we looked at before. We found that the teachers started to develop a meditation practice, and there was some indication, though not significantly different, that they also, some of them at least, took up a contemplative movement practice. Again, we found, although it's not significant at the total scale level, moving in the right direction. The teachers in the program reported greater mindfulness and greater self-compassion over time, and diminished burnout and life stress. And so I would say we have about 7 studies now that, if you were to aggregate all of them, really suggest that there's well-being effects of this program, at least in terms of self-report data. We have some cortisol data and some other biological markers that I'm not going to talk about. We haven't found anything there yet, but we don't have all of the data. We looked at this O-span, which is a task of attention and working memory, and again, this flanker task, which is about response inhibition with the teachers, and again, we were not able to document any effects on these behavioral measures of attention and working memory in this study. Middle schools are kind of complex places. As you know, teachers teach 4, 5, 6 different classes a day, so we were in a conundrum of design. If we wanted to look at classroom change, which classroom do we look at? If you got 5 of them during the day, we can't observe in all of them. We didn't have the money for that. And so we made a decision that may have been fateful in some way. We thought, and this goes to the time course question, let's look at their most stressful classroom. And so we asked teachers to nominate at the beginning of the year, which of your classes do you think is most challenging? And we decided to observe and look for change in that setting. Using the class support, this time we did live rating and video rating. We did an enormous study of trying to compare the two, which one's better, which one's more reliable, and it really depends. But in this case, in terms of training effects, it didn't matter because we, again, were not able to document any changes in classroom behavior over the course of 1 year in the implementation of this program in middle school teachers' most stressful classroom. Again, to summarize, teachers attended the program and seemed to like it, reported that. They reported they started to meditate. We saw improvements in well-being and occupational health, but not in attention and memory, as measured behaviorally. We, again, were not able to document changes in the classroom. And yet, at the same time that this program was going on, I had the great fortune to meet my friend Lana Penley, who's also in the room today, who worked as a Mind-Up trainer and is the principal of a middle school, a K-8 school called Marysville in the district. And we actually had some of our trainings there, and Lana and I became friends, and some of her teachers came into our training who were in the upper grades. And what was really interesting is that Lana's school had been recognized in the district as an exemplary Title I school serving disadvantaged youth. It had burned down at one point, and then Lana had sort of regrouped her school around mindfulness and kindness. And so this was very salient in the district. And we started to think about I was having some thoughts, and she had a lot of great experience. How could we start to take her school, in which the implementation of this work was whole school, and use it as a model to start working with other principals in the district who seemed ready to do the same kind of thing. So again, even though the study was not having all of the effects that we want, we started to think about the work had already entered in Portland. How could our work connect with Lana's work and other things that were going on in the district? And so we joined together and started to try to push the work forward, and there was interest from her boss, associate superintendent in the district, to do that, and so we started to talk about this work. So why didn't we find, I'll tell you a little more about what happened next in a minute, but why didn't we find what we wanted? What is the time course of change? Did we have the right context? What about instrumentality and non-instrument? All of the same questions arose with regard to this study. And really, to be honest, the question in my mind was, is this the path? Is this really the way? And using these short-term studies and these intensive studies. And I had this dissonance because on the one hand, the studies were very challenging and very intense, and yet the demand and the need seemed to keep growing even as the results were challenging. So these were paradoxes to be thinking about. So what happened next in Portland was Lana and I we actually went around with our hat within the district asking for money. Would someone like to support a Mindful Leaders program? Because one of the insights was, again, we have to include the school leader. These are the folks who need to manage and really stand behind the change. So maybe we shouldn't be starting with classrooms, we should be starting with leaders. And so we created a Mindful Leaders program and ran a group with Jelaine Sorensen, our meditation teacher, and some other colleagues for about 9 or 10 school principals who were very interested in starting to do this whole school work. And we had some of the district administrators in the work. I started to think a lot about, I love science. These are really sexy graphs. I really love this stuff, the numbers. But we know that educators think in case-based terms, not in terms of variables, really. And so how could we create some materials that could give an existence proof to educators based on an instance that they could see as a possibility? So we created a beautiful movie of Lana's school and started to use it with our principal groups to kind of give a narrative of what it might look like as you moved along this journey towards creating a mindful and kind school. We started to look at different parts of the school district. There was other things going on. There's something called Peace in Schools in Portland, which is a high school program that juniors and seniors can take. There was Mind Up implementation. There was some interest in early childhood education in this work. Trauma-informed work was coming online, so people needed to understand trauma and how mindfulness could help. And so we started to try to knit together the players. We're still trying, still doing the work, moving forward. And really one of the things we realized is, man, it's really hard to do this work without having someone coordinating it, because Lana and I had full-time jobs, and we were trying to knit together this network and trying to do this where there was no center for it in the district. So this was a real challenge. And so I thought I would just show you a brief 2-minute clip from the movie that we created and that we use. Lana and I have given some talks to school leaders, including with our friends across the river in Vancouver, where we talked to all of the principals a few months back. And I just want to give you a sense of the possibility of what it might look like if we move from a focus on teachers and classrooms to thinking more about school leaders and whole school. And is it really possible to teach kids these kind of things, and what would that look like? So I'll just show you a brief clip from this. I think we need some, I'm going to go back. Get some sound on this one, maybe. Is there sound? It's on my end. Well, it actually says I can't change the sound on my machine. kind of strange. It's not, Oh. Takes a village, you know? Thank you, Kim. Let's see if that works.
We teach the certain monthly practices and the curriculum at the same time on the same day. So from grades K through 8, we're all teaching the same lesson.
We teach it in different ways so that it's developmentally appropriate to the different kids, but the message is the same.
So what we found is, for example, if we're talking about kindness, and I'm a kindergartner, and it goes all the way up to 8th grade, then it's also in our staff meetings and in the office and in the cafeteria, on recess. We're all talking about the same practice.
They're also using language around compassion and gratitude and being mindful, that even in 2nd grade, and not even just in 2nd grade, but kindergartners, they're using these terms that you're just blown away by, but they actually know what they mean, and they have a connection with them, and they're using them in the right way and not just saying things to be saying things.
Perspective is kind of like making yourself see what someone else sees and feel what they feel.
Perspective is like someone, like, for example, let's say that you like hot cocoa and I don't. You have a different perspective.
Kindness is when you help somebody or you're respectful to them and you're not like fighting or being mean.
Kindness means you're sharing, like, your happiness with others, you're making them feel good, and I think it just feels really nice because you're making other people feel nice.
Every time I've been kind, that just makes me the happiest. Everything else has never made me as happy as that before.
Everyone is fighting a battle, you just don't know what it is always. And so you have to be like extra kind to people in case they are fighting something that's serious and it's hard to get through.
Then it becomes much more of just the way we do business. So we want to do much less of compartmentalizing. Like, okay, we're teaching kindness now, and you're only going to be kind in this like 15 minutes. No, it's how do we take this and then integrate it into all of the interactions.
So how can we get it integrated into all the interactions? And so I think this is one of the places I think we want to think about, and where was the work going. So just to wrap up so we can have a few minutes for questions, I just want to say what are some of the implications. We started the work here. I think the findings that we have say that there's a lot of work to be done in thinking about what kinds of programs, at least in the work we're doing, would be needed to help transfer this to pedagogical practice in the classroom. And how can we create programs that support that transfer and support the implementation of programs? And I think we've gained some insight, but aren't there yet. But more importantly, I think the work that we were doing was here in the green zone, and the realization came pretty fast that we needed to be attending to the red zone. As Ellen Skinner, my colleague at Portland State, says, we always have to be thinking about the context in which we're working. That's a systems viewpoint. And so I think a lot of this work is really thinking about how to move this to the school culture level, and then really to the principal level, but also to the district level and the leadership. And that's sort of part of the work we see going forward. And that insight also is consistent with this dialectic, developmental, contextualist viewpoint in which we understand context, we attend to time, and we see people and relationships, what they're doing to and with each other, these collaborations as critically important. I think in my own thinking, I have to set some more realistic goals for the time course of some of these changes. I think we learned that the importance of building these enduring partnerships with educators is absolutely essential to making the work relevant and grounded. And so I hope in the next generation of work, we can think about, as we have done with our two colleagues, really designing programs that address the diversity of people and places and needs, so that we're designing with our collaborators towards the kinds of demands and aims they have, rather than thinking about how we can implement our programs developed from afar in a high quality way. The last thing I want to say is, given Rhonda McGee's talk, and we had a nice pre-conference, which some of you in the room attended, on compassion and equity in educational systems. In the future, I think we need to be thinking about how care and compassion can be taught alongside mindful awareness. And I think that's actually part of a lot of these programs, but can be a bit more of an explicit part. As I've said, focusing on systems and relationships along individual outcomes, and then really focusing on equity and diversity and not just on compassion and common humanity in this work. And I think the key linking tissue there is interdependence. You really can't understand mindfulness without understanding compassion. It's not a versus, it's an and. You can't understand the individual outcomes without understanding the context, I don't think. And we really can't focus just on compassion and common humanity without recognizing the unequal distribution of surplus suffering that is experienced by different groups in our society. So I just want to thank so many of you in the room and so many of our funders for this really fun journey, and thank you so much, and we have a little bit of time for questions now. So I'm aware that there are 2 microphones, and yes, please.
Hi, I'm Katie, and I am a social worker. I'm trying to hold it together. Thanks so much. And I love being able to see the video at the end, and I'm still trying to get words out, seeing those young people talk about the power for this. So you're a social worker, and I wanted to hear more about how you see the relevance to this. This work seems so relevant to social workers and social work education, and also, like you said, it's only as powerful as in social work education as administrators and people who do curriculum development see it as such. And so can you talk a little bit more about how you see this work being applied to social work and social work education, who are people who do see a predominance of surplus suffering in the world and are having to work with their own stuff to be able to do respectful, just, sustainable work?
Yes. Thank you so much. I do have a social work degree, and I have to admit I've never worked with a more committed group of people who were not seen. They do the hardest work in society and are accorded the least recognition for it. I think 2 things. I think these programs, CARE program, mindfulness-based emotion, these programs would work well for these other kinds of caregivers. And I think we know that from the research, and I think Margaret has offered her programs in a variety of settings. So I think just starting there would be great for we talk about a strategy of caring for the caregivers as a really important strategy. I would also say my friend Lana Penley always says that in her school it was important to be her +1, and so her counselor or her social worker, these are key support people who can really leverage the work in schools. And so I'm excited to see in both the Vancouver district and in Portland us reaching out to those other support people and offering this training. So I think there's real value in that. Thank you for your question. Yes?
Hi, I'm Kate. And I have a question, but I also wanted to start to offer a model. I have a role in a university town school district called School Climate Coordinator. We have a climate office that's essentially responsible for diversity, inclusion, and equity conversations in the district. And the way that we have come to mindfulness has been through the long process which many schools have been through around multicultural education, moving through diversity education, but eventually coming to a place about 4 years ago around restorative principles and practices and focus on humanity, relationships, and voice, and healing harm as a base for which we can bring in all kinds of other conversations about equity, broader conversations about race and humanity. And so as we have gone through the trauma-sensitive, becoming trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed, mindfulness has also entered in. And what's really been exciting here is to see the full cycle, that the equity and justice is part of the mindfulness and that the mindfulness is part of that. But it has helped to have a district perspective. And the parallel path that the community has run, where we have a school board that has prioritized social and emotional support for students, has also made much easier to bring in this wave of knowledge and understanding around mindfulness and contemplative practice. So that's a potential model for large-scale change.
Thank you. We would love to hear from you. It sounds like you've been successful in solving, to some degree, what we call the silo problem. You have equity over here, you have social emotional learning, you have teacher wellness, but really the stitching together, it sounds like you've been able to do that. And so I would love to connect with you because I think that's where this needs to go. We want to knit together the contemplative work with these really pressing issues for equity and social emotional learning in school. So that's very exciting that you're a little bit farther down the path than some of ours, and that's wonderful, and we would love to learn from you. Yes, thank you.
Can I ask a question as well?
Yes,
So
quickly.
I think I understood from one of the posters yesterday that something about the fact that when you were bringing teachers to this understanding for their own well-being, and when you were doing it for them, or at some part of the process was doing it for them, so they were doing it with students, that there was less of a positive effect on the teachers, that there was some more obvious positive effect for teachers when it was simply for their own well-being. Is that am I misunderstanding, or was there anything in the findings that it related to that?
I think what I was saying is in the first study, we paid the teachers to come, so it wasn't voluntary, and in the second study it was voluntary, and that initial motivation may matter. I mean, my own sense is that suffering is a primary motivation for engagement in contemplative practices. And as Margaret Cullen says, no matter how many sacred books you look in, because my administrator said so is not in there for one of the reasons. So I think it's an open question as to how the incentivization of participation in these programs affects the long-term outcome. And I think we should put it on the agenda as something we could look at. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Beverly, and I work with teens, bringing mindfulness to them, and especially trying to focus on bringing some mindfulness to their technology use. And so I am really curious what you might be able to share about programs that have had some success getting into high schools and pros and cons of working in that environment.
Yes. What I might suggest is we have some folks in the audience that are working in high schools, and I could share some resources on a University of Washington professor who's working around technology and mindfulness, but I think they may know a little more about that than I, so maybe we could chat a little bit after this ends around your question. I think we have time for maybe one, Oren, I'm so sorry, but maybe one more, and we'll go to lunch.
I hope it's worth it. Thank you. I have two related questions about the scope of the research and also the way that you moved back in starting with teachers and students and then saying, no, we need to look at districts. So I was wondering to what degree you're going even earlier than that and looking at implementing it in teacher training programs, not just a separate teacher training program, but looking at, for example, if you're working in a specific school district, where are the teachers trained, and working with that university or the college where they're trained, and implementing it at that level so that you can potentially reduce some of the instrumentality where they're already busy, they're already trying to deal with all the specifics of the school year, and then on top of that, they have to, it becomes like a patch up, or some of my colleagues have implemented Mind Up and have had a lot of difficulty with it, where it just becomes another to-do because it's not part of their original training as teachers, and they have difficulty letting go of all of the other obligations or fitting it in with that. And related to that, I live and work in BC, British Columbia, and so we just implemented a new curriculum, and the new curriculum has more space to fit in these kinds of things because the competencies are less focused on coverage and more on skills that include holding opposites and things like that, things that you could fill in, that you could, actually make a case for spending a lot of time working on meditation, mindfulness in the classroom. So I wonder to what degree are you working with, district curriculum design obligations in order to make space, because I think a lot of the problem is that there's no space. People are stressed out about coverage and tests, and so it seems that would be the two, moments where maybe you could create opportunity to let the practice breathe within the system,
Yes.
and not make it, as you said, into another to-do where you're ringing the bell and students are like half aware of what's going on, what are they doing, fitting in, rushing to fit in a lesson on mindfulness.
Yes.
So
Thank you. What I love about both of your comments is they're highly contextual and developmental. Wouldn't it be nice if we could move some of this into pre-professional development rather than just professional development? And I think work at Penn State and UVA and the University of Wisconsin, there's some efforts in this regard to look at teacher education program. I think there's some challenges there and some opportunities, but I like the thinking. How could we make this a normative part of teacher professional development and the kinds of skills and dispositions that we want them to have? And I think, we all think in this work British Columbia is a really unique and lovely context, and I again like the idea of a top-down influence where creating space and making value for this kind of work in the curriculum is critically important. And it could well be that the Common Core, with less of a focus on specifics and more of a focus on some of these abilities, could create some of that space. But personally, we haven't engaged in the work with curriculum designers yet, but I again think that's a very fruitful direction to be thinking about, and speaks to this designing with and designing towards the systems that we're working with. So I'm aware that we're a bit over time, and I want to thank you for your attention and kindness.